in this episode.
And maybe I first start by a provocation. And imagine the future in which everything is, all science or a lot of science is done through AI. AI is generating hypotheses. AI is running an experiment, designing an experiment, putting a survey online in psychology, for instance. People are filling the survey. AI does the statistics, writes the paper, submits the paper, reviews the statistics, publishes the paper. Everything happens automatically. And we are wondering then, okay, then what is the role of science in that, of scientists, of humans in that setup? And then is then only philosophy of science what remains? And this is just, of course, an exaggeration, but it is a provocation to try to explain this normativity that philosophy of science brings, because philosophy of science, in my opinion, tries to tell us how science should be done, what should be the norms governing science, and how scientists should act, what is good science with respect to bad science, maybe some demarcations, what brings epistemic benefits, so what helps us learn. And then it used to be, through history of philosophy of science, the main focus on what is the scientific method in opposition to non-scientific method. But I think nowadays we are shifting, and this question is not in the center anymore. So the question that we are now more interested in is about the scientific practice. So what scientists can do and what to improve the way how we as a humanity learn. And also, in a sense, how I think that's the next step when we use AI, how we should interact with AI so that AI helps us to gather knowledge.
Hey everyone, welcome to this conversation that I had with Dr. Vlasta Sikimić, a philosopher of science who's primarily working on scientific practices and the epistemic attitudes of scientists. If you're a listener of the podcast, you probably know that I am absolutely obsessed, or even enamored, for lack of a better term, with the philosophy of science. And I've got to say, I think this is the best conversation I've had with a philosopher of science on the podcast so far, especially because I did find that we built some good rapport in the dialogue, but also, as Dr. Sikimić did mention, she really does practice what she preaches. What I mean by that is, I asked from her if I could bring up Žižek and more of the speculative thinkers. And Vlasta, if I may, was very open to discussing more of the Žižekian speculative claims from his, Marxian, Lacanian tradition of discussing that science itself, in some sense, sits within an ideology. What's its relationship to capitalism and the kind of the social reality of what a scientific practice, a discipline exists within. And we kind of did talk on that, and I found that Vlasta was very open to kind of entertaining my questions, which sometimes more analytical philosophers could be a bit more skeptical of people like Žižek. And I'd say, interestingly, I did mention this in the podcast too. One thing with her work is that she's a very empirically driven philosopher. So a lot of the papers I read of hers it's based on research and studies that she's done with her team, of course. And I always found that quite interesting, especially because, a lot of the things like equity or tolerance, they can be discussed and spoken of, which I think it should be at a rather philosophical, abstract level. But it's nice to see someone putting in the hard work of empirical research and interviewing people and doing what needs to be done to kind of come up with certain conclusions to make certain claims. Saying all that, without further ado, let's get to the podcast. I don't want to prolong this introduction. Although before that, as I tend to do, a bit of a formal introduction. Dr. Vlasta Sikimić is an assistant professor of philosophy of science and a member of the philosophy and ethics group at Eindhoven University of Technology. Her research focus is on the social epistemology of science, metascience, philosophy of AI and ML in science, and philosophy of AI in education. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Vlasta Sikimić.
I just wondered a little bit about your positionality because I noticed that you even studied computer science, so it's very impressive.
Look, I'm just a neophyte. I just studied computer science, but I did a minor in philosophy when I was in uni, and to be honest, Vlasta, like it was interesting, but it was more like, like political philosophy, which is good, but I'm more interested in like the more, well, one thing I love is philosophy of science. I've always been obsessed with it, but also like the more of the grander metaphysical questions, like ontological questions, which is why I love Žižek, because even though he's very political, he's still, he's Hegelian. He talks about what is, and I love those questions. So, um,
But it is impressive that you can follow this literature because even for me, it's difficult when I read him because he refers so much to Lacan, to other people, and you have to know a lot to understand.
yeah.
It's
Yeah, I mean,
impressive.
it's interesting with what I like about him. If you think Žižek has had like Lacan, like it's like an alien language, I mean, although I do read Lacan, he's good, but like what I like about Žižek is I think this is his unique skill. He'll bring a very dense, uh, esoteric philosophical point, but he'll always connect it to like some film, some pop culture, some
True,
example, and that
true,
makes it a bit more palatable.
true.
So that's how I really got into him, because I kind of really enjoyed his like breakdown of like some film I've watched, and I'm like, wow, how did he have this insight that I never had? So, um, but yeah,
I like his political philosophy, but maybe that is related to the fact that we were born in the same country.
I know, yeah. So yeah, I'm hoping to go to Slovenia. In fact,
So I'm not from Slovenia, I'm from Serbia, but it used to be Yugoslavia.
Yugoslavia
So
before it
that's why I
split.
said exactly. So it used to be the same, it's not anymore.
I
But
see.
he's really big in Serbia. So when he comes to Belgrade, there is like an enormous queue of people who want to listen to
Oh,
him and so.
I mean, even here in Australia, like in Melbourne, we have like Jijikian clubs, Jijikian societies. So we have like universities have. I'm a part of something called the Young Jijikians. Like he's got a bit of a cult following. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Partially, I think it's just his funny guy. Is charismatic and all that. But I also think he's a very important philosopher.
I think it's this being part of the pop culture and being present and commenting in the right moment about the things in a provocative way actually requires a lot of work and a lot of courage.
Exactly. Yeah. And but then the thing is though, like again, here's why I like him. Like his book Less Than Nothing, this is like his magnum opus. He has a
Mhm.
whole like 300 pages on quantum mechanics. So he's able to write on
I
very
don't know.
yeah, I mean, he's
That's
able to
very
write on like
brave.
quantum mechanics, but also like comment on, I don't know, Marxist theory or whatever. So it's I don't know, he's like such a broad thinker, which is what I love about philosophers.
Maybe a little bit more intellectual humility would help philosophers, but okay.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's one thing I think he lacks. Yeah, which is why again I think I kind of prefer still the analytical approach which you take, because yeah, it's fun to speculate and all that, but at the same time, I'm a, let's say, to put it in a pretentious way, a child of the Enlightenment. I still believe in reasoning out data, empiricism. I still believe in that.
Okay.
Because if not, you can say anything, right? Like there's no difference between like just having opinions and actually doing intellectual work. Speaking of Vlasta, I guess we'll start off. I'm sorry, I'm already recording,
Second.
so we can just keep going. There's no real like
Mm.
formal way to do this, but
Now I'm ready.
yeah. I think some of my audience, I've already spoken to a couple of philosophers of science, pardon me, and still, I think it's important to kind of discuss what this discipline is, more for a lay audience, and that would include myself. So yeah, just a very elementary question. What is a philosophy of science? What is this discipline, and how does it differ from, let's say, what a scientist would do?
Mhm. I wouldn't say that this is elementary question at all. It is quite a theory-loaded question. And maybe I first start by a provocation. And imagine the future in which everything is all science, or a lot of science is done through AI. AI is generating hypotheses. AI is running an experiment, designing an experiment, putting a survey online in psychology, for instance. People are filling the survey. AI does the statistics, writes the paper, submits the paper, reviews the statistics, publishes the paper. Everything happens automatically. And we are wondering then, okay, then what is the role of science in that, I mean, of scientists, of humans in that setup? And then is then only philosophy of science what remains? And this is just, of course, an exaggeration, but it is a provocation to try to explain this normativity that philosophy of science brings, because philosophy of science, in my opinion, tries to tell us how science should be done, what should be the norms governing science, and how scientists should act, what is good science with respect to bad science, maybe some demarcations, what brings epistemic benefits, so what helps us learn. And then it used to be, through history of philosophy of science, the main focus on what is the scientific method in opposition to non-scientific method. But I think nowadays we are shifting, and this question is not in the center anymore. So the question that we are now more interested in is about the scientific practice. So what scientists can do and what to improve the way how we as a humanity learn. And also, in a sense, how I think that's the next step when we use AI, how we should interact with AI so that AI helps us to gather knowledge, and especially from a group perspective. So we are thinking, because now science is not done in isolation anymore, and it's also always communicated with the public. So how all that happens. So all those interactions are a topic of the contemporary philosophy of science. And there, the line between philosophy of science or psychology and sociology of science becomes fuzzy, in my opinion, but that is perfectly fine.
Yeah, yeah. Why would you say, Vlasta, that there was a change in kind of the zeitgeist where now, as you say, it's more the philosophers are more focused on the practice of science as opposed to more of like, what is science per se?
I mean, there are, again, plenty of reasons. Some of the reasons come from the critiques to this idea of the strict demarcation, right? That we cannot make a strict demarcation. Then, of course, then there is this pluralist approach, because we have, it's also like, are we focusing on natural sciences? Is philosophy also a part of science or not, or has a special status? What is happening there? Or maybe we should just say how much this discussion is going to really bring us. Is that the central question? Is that the center that is that the question that motivates us? Or we are more interested in how can we improve science through practice? And of course, people choose what's to their liking and where they think they can make the biggest impact. For me, for my personal taste, this philosophy of science in practice makes much more sense. So to be engaged with scientists, to see what is meaningful for them as well, how our research can be applied, and to really see how they are reasoning, how they are working in practice, and how can they improve their work. And then from the next level, how we can help them as a society so that their work conditions are better, which will also then later result in better science.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the next question, please be as provocative as you want, and because I think this is quite important. Not, I think this is changing now, but at least in I'd say maybe early 2000s, I felt by more of the scientific popularizers, there was this ideology that philosophy is superfluous, or that it was, like, I remember, I'm not a fan of the guy, but Neil deGrasse Tyson said that, science can answer all questions, and that, science is this like objective discipline, which will get us some kind of ultimate truth. But obviously, maybe you could connect this to the work you've done more in epistemic attitudes, and the kind of the how it pertains to the beliefs that scientists hold. So, in a very general sense, what do you think are the kind of the assumptions or presuppositions that scientists hold, which you think are wrong or flawed, as it comes to the discipline of science, if that makes sense?
Okay, maybe I can answer with kind of with two answers to the first part of the question and
Yes,
to the
please.
second.
Yeah, I know it's a bit of a loaded question. I apologize. Yeah.
It's a great question. The first part we already touched upon a little bit, and this is this big question of, has science killed philosophy? It is one of my favorite topics. And we think first, okay, all science emerged from philosophy as a rational discipline of actually observing how the nature functions and also how the society functions, and more importantly, how they should, well, not nature is only descriptive, but how society should function. And there is this normativity that comes from philosophy, so telling us how something should be in the ideal case. We don't always reach this ideal case, but we should definitely think about it, and the norms and the values that our society is putting, that belongs to philosophical debates, and that is what we have to have always in science. So we cannot separate our values from science. And there your next question plays a role, and this is which values and attitudes should scientists have? Maybe they should have certain virtues, or in Aristotelian sense, character virtues, so how they should behave. And that is now coming closer to some empirical questions. That's why I said philosophy of science comes very close to psychology of science, and we are wondering what is the ideal maybe personality of a scientist. That is much, that is an empirical question that can be answered, right? Is this kind of hexaco model of the personality traits, is there something which is important for scientists, for instance, conscientiousness or openness to experience and so forth? But what I am much more interested in, and that I think is much more fruitful, is to go to this virtue approach, because again, there is a big debate, but my opinion or hope, hypothesis, is that we can train these virtues, and that we can teach scientists how to behave in a way that helps them do both responsible research, but also research that will again be very prolific in the epistemic sense, in the sense of generating more knowledge.
Yeah, it's fantastic. In fact, I think this is a good opportunity to a point that spoke out to me a bit in your paper. Do political attitudes matter for epistemic decisions of scientists? And obviously, I'll leave the links down below to all of these in the show notes. Is you speak of something where junior researchers initially they're a bit more, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, skeptical of the scientific method. And then as they become a part of the kind of the established system, or let's say the culture of a university, these views change. And this is quite hopeful, given that it shows that people can change, people are open. So perhaps you want to comment a bit on what your findings there was as it pertains to junior researchers.
That we detected, again, these are small effects and on a specific population of scientists who were in Serbia. And there we noted that this happened in the case of junior researchers in social sciences. And we also noticed that there is a difference between natural sciences and social sciences, which actually makes sense, because in natural sciences, the method is more established, while on the other hand, social sciences profit from this plurality of opinions, also natural sciences profit from the plurality of opinions, but in social sciences, the rules are not as strict, the results are not as reliable, and in this sense, it makes it is epistemically good that researchers are questioning the method, testing more different methods that can bring new light to their research topics. And that, yes, junior researchers, the more they're exposed and the more they're learning, the more they enter in the science and follow what's done there and trust it in a sense more. That is somehow purpose of education. Okay, maybe another provocation, and that's that every education is in a sense patronizing, so is in a sense shaping us and directing us somewhere. On the other hand, the results and what we reached and how much knowledge do we have is really impressive, right? So just look 300 years ago and nowadays compare it, it is rather impressive. So something is being done right as well.
Yeah. Okay, so you already, Vlasta has touched on what I found quite interesting, where you said, yeah, so social scientists tend to be more open to being critical of the discipline itself over more of the natural scientists. And this gets me to my other question. And again, this is a very speculative question, so please speculate as much as you want. I've been thinking a lot about the idea of hypothesis generation. And to my mind, people like Stephen Wolfram, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He is the person who created Wolfram Alpha. He's a Wolfram Alpha, pardon me. He's a mathematician, and he has this new theory of everything in a book he wrote called The New Kind of Science. Essentially, and it's very controversial, he reduces all of physics to some kind of computational model, which he calls computational irreducibility. So it's very much a hypothesis because it doesn't account a lot of phenomena like quantum mechanics, for instance. But one interesting thing from the place that you come from in the social science perspective is that he because he created this language called Wolfram Alpha. It's like a programming language. He made a lot of money, so he has the kind of the financial freedom to go and explore whatever he needs and get into like all these esoteric, abstruse areas that involves, exploring these more fundamental questions. And then I think of another field like something like IIT, integrated information theory, somewhat controversial in the scientific domain. So these are all hypotheses, right? And my question would be, and apologies for being long-winded, would be how do you think within kind of like a rigid structure in academia, junior researchers or whoever it may be can come up with somewhat novel hypotheses where they don't just stick to the pre-existing paradigms, but they kind of come up with a hypothesis that perhaps could be a new paradigm?
That is an excellent question. And there are a lot of problems which we can, which we would need to address from the social perspective in order to enable more of the research which would be thought-provoking and to give it, because it's not enough that it's being done, it's also whether it's seriously taken by the community.
Yeah.
But let's go step by step. What happens with junior researchers in academia? First of all, there is a lot of pressure on them, pressure to publish. There is a financial pressure. There is a pressure, the family pressure, because for a very long time, these people, I mean, also I am probably one of them, right? I mean, now I'm in a better position, but since very recently, I mean, I was in exactly the same position, right? So you don't have stable jobs, you move through different countries, you move with your family. It is rather challenging, and this pressure is not helping science. That is pretty obvious, and it's from the individual perspective, not very advantageous in the current system how science is funded to test bold hypotheses. That is more good from the societal perspective. Another problem that happens that I heard through interviews with researchers from life sciences, the junior ones, especially the ones from the global south, they were saying that they would have some hypotheses that they would like to test and some problems that they would like to tackle that are related to specific circumstances and diseases that are affecting global south, but there is simply not funding for that because there is not enough interest for that. And that is highly problematic. And it is an injustice that we are witnessing because science, in a sense, follows money. Even in academia, that's something that people often are not aware of. They are also often not aware of that a lot of research conducted by private companies is often, when it's scientific research, is also often funded through public sources. So that in biomedical industry, there is a lot of public funding actually even going to companies for research. This makes it challenging, right? So for them to pursue the bold hypothesis. The other aspect, which we can kind of maybe try to say, okay, something positive, how we can help them, well, they can train something which we would call virtue of perseverance and the intellectual perseverance, so that they don't give up on their hypothesis, that they're persistent in pursuing them. Then there is also important how the rest of the community responds, because if their supervisors are open to these ideas and want to support them, that is that would be very helpful. And that this other aspect, which I said, it's not only what an individual is doing, it's also how the community is responding to that. And then in the end, of course, a lot of these ideas will fail. But we have to keep in mind that science is not only about producing knowledge, it's also about asking questions, refuting hypotheses. So different epistemic practices are important for science. And just focusing on generating positive results is not going to bring so much benefit to science.
Yeah, and you sort of already did touch on this, but correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying that outside of, let's say, empiricism and the method of falsification, the Karl Popperian thing, there is some kind of value for speculative thinking within science. But then the question then becomes, oh, in fact, this perhaps is a good way to go to your other paper. When it comes to like scientific funding, at what point do we know that this is enough speculation or at times wishful thinking, and to know, okay, this is time to end things and move on in some sense. Yeah, so maybe I had another question which was a bit more speculative, but maybe this is a good segue to the paper regarding funding. Firstly, I'm curious, because I'm outside of academia. How would funding differ? I'm just not trying to find the paper. Just a second, please. So that there we go. So this paper is when should we stop investing in a scientific project? But my question would be, I'm curious, when it comes to funding, how would it differ more in the natural sciences from like the kind of funding you would do in the social sciences or the humanities?
Could you maybe be a little bit more specific?
Pardon me. So like when it comes to funding a certain project, and you give a project proposal, and then you ask for grant fund, you ask for scientific grants. Is there a difference between how it's done in the natural sciences, in like physics or chemistry, for instance, from like the humanities, which would involve more of the social sciences, or is the system or is the procedure for giving funding same, generally speaking?
It depends. There are different funding bodies and different ways of funding your project. So if you look at some large European grants. They have similar platforms, especially the individual projects. They have similar platforms, just different panels for different sciences. So the reviewers will be from the same discipline, and then the panel would be from the same or similar disciplines, so from the same cluster of disciplines. But on the other hand, we are also very much aware that there is more funding for natural sciences, and then also different type of grants to which social sciences scientists often cannot even apply for. And then, of course, when you then you look at high energy physics and these really big projects, large projects, they get funding differently. So they directly get the funding. It's not through any competitive process where there will be a ranking of projects and so forth, because it's just such large collaborations. They are outliers. So the communication also goes in a different way. Another thing that can happen, and that we all know, it's a common theme, often mentioned in philosophy of science now again in press because of the movie Oppenheimer. That's that after the Second World War, physics attracted a lot of funding, and then together with physics, math got a lot of funding. It was just very in. And a lot of money was poured in these fields. So there can be some completely non-scientific, there can be some completely non-scientific reasons why certain disciplines are at some point popular and get a lot of funding.
Yeah. And so just on the note, what were just
and maybe this is important. When we think about funding, it's not only scientists decide in a way about the ranking, who should get funding, who is excellent, or whatever they call it. I dislike that term. I dislike that paradigm. But anyway, however,
can you
sure, I will.
Okay.
However, the governments still make programs and which type of projects and topics they will fund. And this is not always irrational. That sometimes makes a lot of sense. When we had COVID crisis, it made perfect sense that a lot of money was just invested in solving that crisis. That made that was justified. So there is this synergy. Yeah, I think it's highly problematic because, first of all, that maybe has to do with something with my positionality. But I definitely think that so the country where I come from, the science was not considered as a vocation, but we would call scientists scientific researchers, workers. So nor as any normal worker. So there was nothing special about it. It was just one of the jobs. And that is maybe that takes away the privilege, but it also makes scientists closer to people. And it also helps them not to destroy their lives by working 12 hours a day or more, but just going to their job, finishing their job, coming home, and continuing with their life. That is one aspect. So that comes from this individual perspective, that I don't think that this elitism helps science, because it alienates it from other people, so from the general public, and science should be done in order to help the general public. That's one thing. The second thing is, of course, that we are starting to have this global injustice, not starting to have, we have it since forever, right? That science is part of the rich, privileged communities who can afford it. It is also targeted to benefit them, while others benefit less. That is something that will hopefully change, and is maybe changing, but of course it is slow.
Okay, excellent. I was going to ask you about epistemic equity, and this is a good opportunity for that. But before we get there, just for the listeners, I'm wondering, again, I'll leave it in the show notes, but what were your findings, just general findings of the paper? When should we stop investing in a scientific project?
That paper was more, I mean, I don't know how reliable these findings were. So findings were. That paper, I think, more has the value in the conceptual idea. And this is that we might have this sunk cost bias. And that means that once we are invested very much in something which doesn't give a result, we don't like to stop it, but we just like to continue investing more and more resources, even though there is no real outcome, real result. And of course, that won't always be the case, but it is instructive because it could tell us, okay, maybe we should try some other approach. And I mean, I assume that because yeah, you are probably also as a computer scientist trained a lot in math, and I did logic, and there you really see you have to try different approaches if you want to solve a problem. And you notice, okay, we are stuck with this approach, we should try something else. And this was basically the idea, to see whether we can, using AI, whether we can see some trends, that certain projects were inefficient and that it didn't make sense to extend them any further. In the case of physics, and we noted something, how reliable it is. It is more. I think the value of that paper is exactly this idea. Okay, we should be careful about it. We should be aware of the sunk cost bias and not just invest more and more resources if something is not giving result, but instead maybe it's better to try something new.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I concur, because that's the bit I really wanted you to touch on. Given I hear the idea of sunk cost fallacy. It's a term used, like it's like a pop business term used in like entrepreneurship and whatnot, but I don't really hear it much used in the context of, let's say, academia or even scientific research, because in my view, at least, and I may be wrong, the constraints are a lot less as opposed to like a business which needs to have, profit margins and all that. But then this paper made me realize, okay, no, the psychological aspect of the sunk cost fallacy certainly applies to scientists too, because they're human beings too.
Yes,
But
the same as confirmation bias. So scientists really want that their hypothesis is confirmed.
yeah. And again, this goes back to our previous, that when we started conversing, the importance of still having some kind of empirical approach to intellectual thinking, as opposed to completely being lost in pure speculations, because of course then confirmation bias comes into it. Alrighty, so again, this is a bit of a tangential point, but this is also, I think, quite important. Let me just try to find the exact question. Yeah, so this is from your paper, how to fight linguistic injustice in science, equity measures and mitigating agents. So firstly, perhaps you could give us an understanding of what is epistemic equity, and then afterwards, just discuss what your findings are. What do you think are the most important insights from this paper, how to fight linguistic injustice in science?
Mm-hmm. The equity would be epistemic is related to learning, and equity would be to really help people as much as they need, so that they all reach a certain level. And there are many arguments why we want that among scientists. First of all, we want science to be on a high level all over the globe, or we should want it. This is this philosophical point, that normatively how it should ideally be. And again, let's use COVID as an example. We saw the virus doesn't respect borders, and we want that the virus is confronted everywhere in the world. Otherwise, the whole planet is endangered. Or in medicine, right, wherever we travel, wherever we go, we rely and hope the doctors will be equally skilled to help us and so forth. So this is some sort of a universal value. We want strong universities because research and education do go together, and we want this type of knowledge everywhere to be on a high level and on a high reliable level. So that makes sense to me. But to achieve it, we might need some equity measures. So we might need to help certain people to reach this level. They have this aspiration, but we have to help them to be there. On the other hand, it can also relate to something much more basic, and that's that there is already certain epistemic injustice done towards certain scientists. And here, this linguistic injustice is a great example, because we have now English as lingua franca of science, the common language of science nowadays, and not everyone is a native English speaker or was able to live in an English-speaking country and so forth. And because of that, these people, even though they are great researchers and have great findings, cannot communicate them properly. And there, the equity measure is to help them to communicate this research with the rest of the scientific community and not just dismiss it. And for this, we might need to help them a little bit more, to invest either in translations, to have someone acting as a mitigating agent, so someone to try to help them to communicate their results in the better language, but also training the dominant group not to be superficial and not to focus on the form, but to focus on the substance. And what you were saying just now about a lot of these this culture that is training us how we should be good entrepreneurs, how we should be good speakers, how we should be good presenters. It's all focusing a lot on the form, but why doesn't it teach us how to be good listeners? Right? So why doesn't it teach us, okay, let's be less superficial and be more patient, give someone more credit, and that's the point of these epistemic equity measures. And
Yeah.
we had in this paper a great example of Harald Zurhausen's team, who discovered that cervix cancer is caused by an oncovirus, and this is a really common cancer, which now there is fortunately a vaccine to prevent it. But when they presented their findings in the beginning, first of all, these findings were unexpected, so scientific community didn't react well to them. Second of all, when there is even a report of the team of Zurhausen, when they were like saying they spoke in English at a conference, and they were German, and their English was not so good. And then they said we didn't, one of them had a little bit better English, but didn't really understand the questions. And the other person didn't understand at all what they're asking because of the language barrier. And everything just went down the drain. That's how they describe it. And it took quite some years. And even there are testimonies that even Zurhausen himself struggled a little bit with English and then got some additional help and so forth. And this is a very superficial reason to block a life-saving finding.
Yeah, I recall you discussing this, I believe, in the Dissenters podcast too. I thought that was a perfect example of why epistemic equity is necessary. And if I could just comment on this, I also found this, Melbourne, Australia, is a very multicultural society, and of course we have a lot of non-native English speakers, and they could be having PhDs in high energy physics or quantum physics or whatnot, but firstly, some people generally are a bit more introverted. They tend to be a bit more reserved, and as a result of that, I find that there had been a lot more just this kind of prejudice based on a person's personalities in some sense. Whereas they're brilliant researchers, brilliant minds, but ipso facto that they don't speak English as their first language, or simple fact that they're introverted, it has affected their academic life. And I personally know friends of mine who this happened to, and I'm sorry to say this is quite unfortunate. I can't, I'm quite embarrassed, but this is mostly women, that it's happened to. And I don't know, I'm sure it's got something to do with historical injustice and whatnot. Although, speaking of this, Vlasta, I'm going to ask you a very provocative question, and I certainly
But can
don't.
you comment on this?
Of course, please. I'm so sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's very important, and it's good that you noticed it, because science, of course, was very close to women, and science is also often has this very masculine culture, so a rather competitive culture. In which collaborative work or this more invisible work is kind of trying to help the team to develop something and so on is valued less. It's much more valued who pushes that their name is the first cited, first author name and so forth. There are even studies pointing out that women have smaller offices in science than men. So it's really shocking when you
I'll
would
take
think
note of
about
that.
it.
Yeah.
And
Do that.
because and I mean, I don't think that I definitely think it has to do with this masculine culture. So I don't want to and masculine in this negative sense, right? So I don't want to. It's not only about women; it's also about all the other underprivileged groups. But it is. It has a toxic culture very often, and we have to. That is something that we talk about now. Kind of us who are in science, we should try to be the change that we want to see in science, and that means, yeah, let's wear pink, let's wear makeup, let's do something rather feminine, let's just show that this is fine, let's put rainbow flags in our offices and so forth, whatever someone likes to point out to, just to show that science is diverse and that we are all diverse and that that's something enriching.
Yes.
And not that we have to have this stereotype of, a serious man either in a white coat in a lab or in a suit and so forth.
Yeah. Or the old white guy doing science. Yeah, that certainly is a very outdated idea, and perhaps it was never true if you look at, historical trends in science.
But it's also up to the teachers not to allow and not to always reward aggressive behaviors in these Q&As and so forth. So that is important. I always say to my students, it's important how you answer to the questions, but it's also very important how you ask a question. And you ask a question first by saying thank you for giving this presentation and saying what you liked about it, and only then point out to your question or maybe critique and so forth.
Okay, this perhaps touches onto your work on the philosophy of education. So I'm curious, Vlasta, do you think it makes sense to kind of make it a part of any natural sciences degree, be it physics or chemistry or biology, where, first year undergraduates are taught how to be good peers? It can come off like in more the Aristotelian sense, how to inculcate the virtues of being a good student, and that becomes a part of the curriculum and the syllabus.
Yes, I love that. But what I actually currently work on is similar, slightly different. It's more on teaching them how to virtuously use AI. So to be aware of all the problems that AI might bring and all these injustices, so AI can increase this by all the biases, but also these epistemic injustice and so forth. It can also help us to automatically translate at conferences and whatever, but it can definitely give biased comments and results and texts and so forth. And in this sense, we should take care which values the AI is giving us, right? But also how we as humans are approaching it, and that we have to stick to our own values. And that's something that I would like to teach my students, but I love your comment because it does go more general. And there is currently no real program about it, but of course we always try through our courses to do that. But I think having a structured program that would talk a little bit about these intellectual virtues, because the intellectual virtue is always in the middle. It's about being curious, but curious about right questions. It is about being epistemically tolerant, but still able to distinguish what is not worth of our attention. And in this sense, I think it would be very, very helpful to teach future academic citizens about that, and also to point out how much values play a role in every decision that they make. So in every decision, in choosing the subject that we're going to study, we do make a lot of value-loaded decisions, and we are often not aware of them. Some of these values will be epistemic ones, but because we are really curious about a certain question, but some might be completely non-epistemic ones. Like we think we can get money by doing this type of work.
Yes, in fact, that's a really good point you just made. Žižek makes the exact point in different contexts. He said, so you just said that a choice itself, it comes with a set of pre-held values. It's value loaded, and I'm trying to understand. Like maybe I'm sorry to put you on the spot here, but if you could think of some kind of example, because I think this is something I've been thinking about a lot in the past year or so. That idea that every choice itself comes, there's no like objective outsider's choice that comes kind of like out of heaven or something, that it always comes with a certain pre-held beliefs and ideologies we hold on to. So I'm wondering if you could kind of elaborate on that, please, Vlasta.
I'm not sure whether I can generalize it to that extent, but maybe I can talk about, for instance, all the reasons that influenced me doing philosophy.
Yes, please. That'd be excellent. Yeah.
And I love the discipline. I had the opportunity to study it during high school. That is something rather specific for our educational system in Serbia, and together with logic, and that fascinated me, and I wanted to study it. So that was my epistemic reason. But then there was also some other external reason. I was thinking, okay, this country is not very rich. And if I would study some natural science, there is not a lot of funding to do some experiments or to have some labs. And if you do philosophy, there is this joke, like, what do you need for math? Well, you need a pencil and a rubber eraser, right. Exactly. And what do you need for philosophy? Well, you just need a pencil and a paper. And the point was really, I really thought, okay, with philosophy, I just need to read and I need books and the internet and not much more. And then I could maybe excel in it. So there were a lot of reasons. And then probably also something related to personality that attracted me to be a thinker. But yeah, also I assume a lot of philosophers need some of these motives and to think that they can also answer these big questions. That's a little bit preposterous, but we have it ourselves. And then something completely also secondary, and that's the feedback that you get from your environment. And I got super positive feedback from my high school teacher of philosophy.
Yeah. Now,
like a lot of factors when you think about it.
Yeah. This is
just one decision.
Absolutely. I mean, look, when we get to the more speculative stuff, I want to ask you about Žižek. We can discuss this, but I think there's a lot there, which especially people that come more from the let's say the analytical philosophy tradition should think about. And I think now finally, especially with like, for example, Heidegger and Mary Small-Ponty being used more in cognitive science, these questions are being spoken about, like how our environment affects our subjectivity, and so on.
I mean, I would like to, or I would be hopeful that nowadays this distinction between analytic and continental philosophy is not as strict as it used to be.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, in a way, it doesn't even make any sense, because if you think about it, at the end of the day, it's all philosophy. Like, they all come from the same tradition, from like Plato and Socrates. And then suddenly in the 20th century, yeah, there were some philosophers in Europe, and then they became continental philosophers. I don't know why that distinction even exists per se.
I mean, that is a debate by itself. One answer that could be given would be that analytic philosophy was, in a sense, a response to the rising Nazism in Europe, and it had this idea behind it that we should make philosophy understandable to everyone and use the language accessible to everyone, because all humans are equally rational and able to rationally think, and so it had and the scientific method can be decomposed and also accessible and so forth. So it had some humanitarian idea behind it.
I see. I see.
Then it became rather tedious later, and,
Yeah.
and a lot of the hypotheses were refuted and so forth. But the motivation itself, also that is not the only motivation by far, but it had this this idea. Okay, let's make philosophy understandable for everyone.
For the masses.
Let's speak in a language, in a simple language, and let's make these difficult concepts easy and used in a common language. And I think that's nowadays probably the biggest difference that might be visible is the language that is being used between people who are trained in kind of different paradigms, whatever we call them. But the topics are the same.
Yeah. I mean, that's I think what's really interesting, and I find the most interesting thing is, at least from the little I've read, are the people who can synthesize between and kind of have interplay between these paradigms and not kind of fit into one box, because then I don't see any kind of new novelty in in terms of idea and hypothesis generation, if that makes sense. All right, Vlasta. So I was going to ask you this is a thought I had in my head when reading your paper on linguistic injustice and kind of epistemic equity. Again, I certainly don't believe this, but I'm just going to devil's advocate here. So the person that came to my mind, not a person, a certain like caricature of like that came to my mind was like some like right-wing person who says that, oh, science should be pristine and it should kind of be objective and not be corrupted by these, woke people or left-wing people. This is again, I'm devil's advocating, and then firstly, the idea that equity or DEI, as they say, is it's like it's propaganda, it's ideology. So my question was this: here's what I wrote. I said that how can we promote epistemic equity? Pardon me. How can we promote epistemic equity while also ensuring the scientific method, if such a thing exists, is not impaired? Do you get what I mean? Like people have this idea, and I see this a lot, especially more like in the in like the corporate culture, where they say, oh, we shouldn't care about things like equity or diversity, or just focus on some kind of an objective method, or focus on meritocracy, a very common term used, like especially here in Australia. And then how would you respond to that from kind of the work you've done to a person like that? Again, I'm devil's advocating here.
Sure. I could respond to them in stronger or in more mild ways.
Oh, be as
So
strong as you can. Yeah.
no, let's first try bridging. So to
Okay, fair,
respond in a
fair.
mild way, and then we can escalate
Yeah,
it.
that's something.
So in a more mild way, we can say, okay, actually, there are a lot of studies that show us that scientific community is benefiting from diversity. And diversity of thoughts, I mean, they're actually really like agent-based models of Kevin Zollman that show that cognitive diversity is beneficial for discovering new hypotheses in biology. And that makes a lot of sense, I think, also intuitively, right? So the diversity will help us broaden our knowledge from the group perspective, and we cannot have diversity without inclusion. Inclusion assumes equity measures. Otherwise, it's not a proper inclusion, but we just are assimilating someone or integrating someone in the dominant paradigm. So this person has to just, right? We want to hire someone who will bring, we are a group of philosophers, and we want to hire someone who does psychology to bring us new perspective and do some empirical philosophy. But then this person comes and we say to this person, yeah, but now you should just publish theoretical papers. That doesn't work, right? And if we want this person to help us, we then have to adjust our language, have to adjust our expectations, and the whole team has to dynamically change because then we are hiring someone who is not a philosopher and who will not speak in our way, who will probably not know all the references that we know, and we will, on the other hand, also not know all the references that this new team member is bringing to us. So there it makes tons of sense. But if we want to escalate it, well, we do know that first we can just slowly, right, say that this epistemic diversity is connected with social diversity, and there it makes a lot of sense to have it. But maybe we don't want diversity only as a means to achieve epistemic benefit. Maybe we want diversity and equity as a value by itself because we want a just society, and that's what we believe is justice, and it is our core value. It gives the meaning to our life.
I see. So there's the pragmatic approach, and more like the, let's call it, deontological approach, the Kantian way. It's something's virtuous. I see. Okay. That's important. I'm gonna clip this bit out and make a clip out of it. Your answer to that, because I think that's a succinct way of putting it. All right, now I want to get into your work on machine learning, AI, and then how that pertains to the philosophy of education. But again, a bit of an elementary question. I have to ask you this. So firstly, a big thing I see especially after the LLM phenomena in the past 2 years, is this idea of bias, inbuilt bias and all that. So, and something I've been thinking about is, when building ML models, can we really have unbiased data? And I'm wondering if this is something we can ever achieve, and what your thoughts are on that.
There I would definitely refer to Sabina Leonelli and her work on data, where she would say that there is no raw data. Every data is always interpreted. It's collected for a certain purpose. It's clustered in a certain way. Then it could travel. So then it could be used for another purpose. But it is always so people who curate the data, the reasons why they curated it will always influence it. So that is, I mean, this first response, whether there is anything such as raw data. And the second response is, if we want non-biased data, then we would have to have a non-biased society.
Exactly.
And if you want to increase the justice in the data, then we have to increase the justice in the society. But of course, there are, and I'm sure that you know that better than me, there are certain methods of debiasing algorithms, and maybe even putting some equity measures and intervening both on the level of the algorithm and on the level of the data and so forth to fight this problem.
Yeah, I'm coming to realize that it seems as if it's not like an idyllic state we can ever achieve, but it's rather something we should consistently kind of strive towards, an ideal we should work towards, making data unbiased. And I don't think we'll have like one day where, oh, okay, now all data is pristine and objective, because as you pointed out, there's no raw data, to put it simply. And just on the note, I mean, just for like a general audience, I read this book a few years ago, which is the Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World, by the journalist Caroline Criado Perez. An excellent book that just, in very simple language, lays down how much all these pre-existing, prejudices account into not just machine learning, but just like general, let's say, social science, in that sense. All right.
Yes.
So the other,
I
go
mean,
ahead.
there is one point that people often don't think about, and that's that even our language discovers, and we see it in the artificial translators or LLMs and so forth, that we also have a lot of bias and prejudice against animals. and especially these speciesisms, so that certain species are really negatively depicted, and negative attributes go together with them and so forth. So that is something which people don't think a lot about, but now it's becoming a thing. And maybe there we can be proud a little bit that in Serbia, thanks to Thilo Hagendorf, my colleague from Tübingen, who also works with Peter Singer on the topic of the discrimination of animals in the AI paradigm. We now, I advocated for this, and now in the guidelines for the responsible use of AI in Serbia, we mentioned that also we have to take care that there is no strong discrimination of animals.
Excellent.
Non-human animals.
Yeah, I will email you after the podcast, and I'd love to get some of that research if I could just put it on the show notes. So
Sure.
I'll send you an email with the regarding all the stuff that you mentioned, just so that we have like a proper we collate all these papers together. And then the other question, and I'm sorry, this is a bit of like a pop question. Maybe you're like fed up of this question, to be honest, because anyone that does any work on AI and ML is asked this question, I know, which is the question of AI alignment. I find a lot of the discourse around it sometimes a bit mundane or overblown. So my first question would be, do you believe AI alignment is this major existential issue that is going to be this kind of threat that's going to, kind of fundamentally change what it means for us to be human? Or do you think it's just another one of those myriad things we should have in the back of our mind, but not be made the biggest priority at this moment?
I cannot fully answer because I think that it depends on how AI will develop. So what will actually be the expansion? So how far will it go? The further it goes, the bigger the danger. What I do think makes a lot of sense is because people often override their own beliefs because the AI is telling them, or a machine is telling them, it doesn't even have to be AI. So people often trust the machine more than themselves. And that can particularly be dangerous if you're talking about children. So putting emphasis, which is now being put on the values, ethical values that could come from AI, but the same would hold for epistemic values. So for any normative philosophical content, it is important that this is aligned. And I think there are two ways, right? One is that we intervene on the outputs that we are receiving from AI. And another thing is what we talked in the beginning is how do we accept what we are receiving? If we accept it critically, if we reflect about it critically, if we have the virtues to be critical and to understand that it has to be balanced, what we are receiving, that would be very helpful, not only when it comes to the information that we receive from, well, that's not really information, but to the output that we are receiving from AI, also to all the information we are receiving in this misinformation crisis, which AI might only propeller.
I see. If I could ask of Vlasta, I mean, I couldn't find any publications on this, but given you've done work on the philosophy of education, are there any papers or any kind of research you've done on this specific matter of like how we accept information from in this case machines, let's say?
I didn't. I have a paper under review, which is about the, then we see how it goes, about the injustice, global injustice that might happen with the use of AI in education, with the extensive use of AI in education, so that some groups won't be represented there, and we have to be careful about that, and that these digital solutions won't be available everywhere equally, and if they're really so beneficial, then people who don't have access, because a lot of people simply don't even have computers, that will cause that can cause additional inequalities in the world.
Yeah, I would love to read that when if you end up publishing. I hope you do, because And the reason initially I was a bit hesitant to ask you about this AI alignment issue is I find, at least in my country and even in the States, Australia, um, a lot of this discourse around the AI alignment issue, they make it seem as if some kind of like mathematical abstract discourse, uh, removed from the existing political dialogues, existing kind of social realities. They think that AI alignment can be solved detached from politics and sociology, which in my case is quite the opposite. That, again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but in my view, the real crisis isn't AI. It's our existing neoliberal capitalist system that kind of exacerbates more inequality and exacerbates more prejudice and injustice globally. And then AI is merely a tool that'll just make things worse. So the real question should be, well, this probably even touches on to the question on data. What are the current problems we currently have in a society? And would AI make those things worse? If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yes, it makes perfect sense. And I would tend to agree, yes.
Yeah, excellent. Alrighty, okay. This was also one of my favorite papers because despite being quite interested in the philosophy of AI, I hadn't thought of this, the idea of machine learning in scientific grant review. It was, I think, my favorite paper of yours that I read, just because kind of where you kind of laid down the method, the procedure was quite interesting. I really appreciated that. So, sorry, just to reread the title of the paper. This is Machine Learning in Scientific Grant Review, algorithmically, pardon me, predicting project efficiency in high energy physics. So yeah, I'm wondering what do you think are the most important insights of this paper, and then yeah, kind of what the conclusion was.
The fact that we now have this tool makes it very appealing to use it, because it makes the grant review system much quicker and also less labor intensive to scientists, and also cheaper for funding agencies. So though it is appealing and our results do show moderately high accuracy, we still really warn that one has to be very careful before applying it, that if it's applied irresponsibly, it can cause a lot of problems. Because there is something about the values that we will add using the system. And if we are now just running that system over all sciences, that will be a problem. If we are, so we have to cluster them properly if we would want to try it. However, depends what are we going to use as inputs and outputs. If we are using citations as outputs, that can be rather unreliable because there is a replication crisis in many disciplines. And a lot of papers that maybe even have high citations get retracted or cannot be replicated and so on. Those are all the problems of this method. And this method, in that sense, could then increase injustice. On the other hand, it does have some idea of some merit that can be measured. Then we could try, so to go beyond that paper, we could try to have algorithms trained on the preferences of human reviewers. So to add something more, like what do you value more, the publication record of the principal investigator or the number of PhD students that will finish successfully as a result of funding this project, that would finish their thesis? And that could be something. Or if you want to add like motivation of researchers as an extra variable that can be measured by human reviewers. The point is there that even if we train algorithms on preferences of experts, that gives us something, but we still need to have in mind that we shouldn't just let science loop, what I mentioned in the beginning, that the science is just evaluated algorithmically, and then a lot of proposals are maybe written algorithmically, and everything is happening in this automated way, because we have to add the normative component of what exactly we want to achieve, which values we want to fund, and that is influenced by the opinion of the public, by experts who are working on philosophy of science, for instance, and also some societal needs. So that has to be carefully thought through. So there definitely is the warning. So yes, this is appealing, but we should not solely rely on it. Maybe it can be considered as one of the methods of funding scientific projects. If we have this pluralist idea, let's maximize the diversity of scientific projects, and then let's fund them through these different and evaluate them through these different schemes. And then maybe as one, this can be applied, but as a single one, there is a grave danger. So that was this paper is supposed to point out to many aspects that could potentially go wrong and how to do it right if you really want to do it. I think it's wiser to use it more internally, to such methods, to get some recommendations how one can optimize a research team. For instance, if the research team is too big, or if there are not enough people supporting each other, senior researchers supporting early career researchers and so forth, then they're not receiving enough guidance, which is a problem for the team. And in this context, such optimization techniques would be helpful. But again, so our point of that paper is, yeah, this can be done, but it has to be really done carefully. What we also did, we qualitatively first compared all the projects that later were analyzed using algorithms. And I fear that if someone would apply that in practice, they wouldn't follow this thorough methodology.
I see, yeah. And just on that, you were talking about because you gave a talk on this paper too, I think, which I listened to a few days ago. You were talking about the limitations of citation-based analysis. And then you made an interesting point, which you said that, all fields can't be treated equally. And I believe you used biology and philosophy as the two, the two fields to contrast. Could you kind of elaborate on that a bit, please? Because I thought that was an interesting point.
Biology is just a much bigger field, has many more researchers, and of course the citation metrics will be much bigger. This is, simply mathematical, a simple mathematical fact. And in philosophy, which is a much smaller field, the citations, even in the top philosophical journals, will be read by fewer people. And actually, there is something interesting. If you want to do really influential philosophy, then they tell you, okay, philosophy of science. Then you publish something in a journal that philosophers are appreciating, and then also something in a journal that scientists are reading. So one to get visibility within the field, and another one to get the citations. However, I do see the point that can be made, and this is that, of course, some philosophers did shape our reality with their theories, and in that sense are exceptionally influential as well.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I would say, and again, I'm getting very speculative here. In my view, all scientists are some kind of like Kantians. Like they think, they work within this kind of quote unquote transcendental horizon, and they're like, we can only, because it's an empirical discipline, right? So it's only what you can perceive and observe and measure. So in some sense, and this probably leads us to Žižek. But anyway, we'll get there soon. Hopefully, we'll have time for it. The idea that we all of science is still, it kind of exists within kind of like a symbolic space, to use a term by Žižek, and it's not like we can step outside of that. But in any case, I thought that was quite interesting. And the other question would be, This again touches on to your other work too, kind of the interplay between ethical and epistemic concerns. So I'm wondering if you could explain what you meant by that, what the interplay is.
That is a very good and contemporary topic.
Certainly, yeah, I thought so too. Yeah.
What is, for me, as someone who does epistemology, who is focused on epistemology of science, so on the way how scientists are learning, and especially on the way how scientists are learning in a group, you do see that it is often the ethical components are prerequisites, right? So if you want someone to be epistemically just, then this person should also be just in a non-epistemic context. It's somehow a prerequisite for it. And that seems simple as it is, though of course we can have some science that is doing experiments which are giving results and bringing some knowledge, but are completely unethical. And that's not what we want. So the ethics comes first, then and then our desire for knowledge. So in this sense, it should align. But it is also very provocative and interesting to think about, can ethics in the context of these new developments, in the context of, for instance, AI in education, because education is there that we also learn. And we are then now learning with this new tool. And we are now talking, okay, about the ethical use of some AI for educational purposes. So for instance, of automated feedback to students. And can we then think about this without considering epistemic consequences? Well, not really, because the purpose of this intervention is to give some epistemic benefit. And then, yeah, but then there will be the issue with privacy, because a lot of data of students will be shared with the system. And then is this epistemic benefit outweighing the ethical concern of privacy of students? And in these specific contexts, it's really hard to disentangle the two questions, and one should have a holistic approach.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah. All right, Vlasta, I want to be mindful of your time. Is it okay if we go about 10 minutes over time, just to discuss Žižek? Would that be all right with you?
I mean, it's after midnight here, so
Oh my God, it's
like
after
I have
midnight. I'm
another
so sorry.
appointment.
You could have picked an earlier time on the schedule. I didn't know it was that late for you.
No, everything else was like 4 o'clock in the night and stuff.
Oh, okay. I
So
should
this was
keep
the
this in
best.
mind. I try to open up in the scheduler as much time as I can, but yeah, okay, I'll keep that in mind and give more time slots for the guests, because I don't mind waking up at 1 a.m., but I don't want you to be up to 12. Yeah, because
No. I exactly meant the opposite. It's not like I'm running to another meeting. I might just speak a little bit slower because I'm tired,
let's
but it's not that anyone is waiting for me.
no, you're a good balance for me, because I speak really fast and I also talk too much sometimes. So I need a bit of a yin yang over there, the just to balance it out with the pace. All right, Vlasta, since you've given me permission to ask you about Žižek, I would love to. So I was thinking where to ask about, and I realized
Well, listen. So you can ask, and I will answer something, and then we later decide whether it goes or not. Because
Of course, yeah, that's totally fine. And in fact, I the whole podcast, any part you want me to leave out, we can leave out. Certainly we can do that. So I was thinking, okay, where do I start? I mean, you're firstly a philosopher of science, but then I realized that a lot of your work is also in epistemology, and Žižek has some interesting takes on epistemology. So let's not discuss like all of his like quantum mechanics, ontology. That stuff. It's interesting, but pertaining to your work, I think his epistemology is what's more apt, let's say. So this is from his paper, which I read a while back. It's called Philosophy, Science, Capitalism, and Truth. And in the abstract, and just for the listener, I'll read this out. He claims that it is easy to show that modern science itself relies on a series of philosophical propositions. And then he says, second, what accounts for the role of science in our world is is its link with capitalism. And then he says, third, we should distinguish between knowledge and truth. Not only philosophy, other discourses like Marxism or psychoanalysis also practice a notion of truth, which cannot be reduced to mere knowledge. So my first question, just on that bit of the abstract, would be, do you believe there are other discourses that give us truth, not just knowledge, but fundamental truth outside of science?
Of course, the question is so if we are seeking for some truth about ourselves, can that be generalized to that we claim that this is science, or can we say that it's such a rigid method that it's science? Probably not. Making normative philosophical claims and so forth, there is this big discussion whether this is science or not, but it is something, some maybe maxims, so some principles according to which we would like to behave and to function. But what I find more relatable in Žižek's work is this other comment that he makes about capitalism and how science was through history and also to now till nowadays benefit the privileged groups, and benefited the privileged narrative, and was also nowadays it's also funded also in the past. But the public opinion always influenced science, and politics influence science, but science on the other hand, and that's also what Žižek mentions in this paper, science on the other hand also influences back public opinion and influences back politics, because it does still tell us something which is supposed to be more or less objective. And it is still the best we got, still, and the best we also have. So then there is this high expectation from science to also critically reflect about the current situation and to try to improve it. And that's all great. But then I would like to add the third layer, that if you think about the practices that scientists are actually having within the community, these practices are sometimes even worse than capitalist practices in companies. So are maybe even more outdated and even more rigid in the structure, in this what we mentioned, this masculine toxic environment in which it operates, because there is less regulation about the communication culture, and there is a lot of, we on the one hand call it academic freedom, and it's really great, but on the other hand it can be used as a gatekeeper so that the old structure still prevails, and that some old figures are still there. And yeah, that I forgot to mention before, but with this question of the gender balance in science, that of course there is also strong sexual harassment in science, and nobody speaks about it. And I mean, now we are starting to open and to be more aware of it. But there is a high hope, and then there is a problem coming from within the community, and also coming externally to the community through this publish or perish paradigm that's imposed to scientists, and that has something to do with capitalism, of course.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, in fact, that was my next question, because I was going to ask, between your work on epistemic attitudes and our scientific epistemology, and then Žižek's more speculative claim that science can be a domain to advance capitalist ideology, or the patriarchal ideology, for that matter. And I'm assuming you would agree with him on that.
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent.
And all definitely right. The technology, we love technology, and it's great that we have it, but of course it is often used and abused in these commercial ways.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, this probably even goes back to the work kind of on like scientific funding, like what projects get funded. And some of these projects are funded by private companies and private corporations. I mean, I've read many stories. I can't think of any off the top of my mind, but there are many stories of even scandals where there's been bias in certain studies because it was funded by a certain
Yes.
organization and whatnot. Yep, certainly. Alrighty,
Yes.
now let's
But
get to
maybe it's nice still to give some benefit, also something to say something positive about scientists,
of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
what
I mean,
motivates them. Yeah.
I mean, we're being critical out of love, right? Like, I mean, you know, this in no way I'll be saying that scientists are the same as like some, I don't know, some politician in Texas, you know, like it's not we're not putting them on the same playing field. But sorry, go ahead, Vlasta. Yeah.
Yes, I think often when you talk to them, they actually will tell you some noble motivation that they had to that they had to become scientists and to dedicate so much time and energy to science, even though it's maybe not bringing as much money as some job in industry would bring. And people who work in biology would say, okay, we would like to cure this disease, or we would like to produce more efficient crops so that more people get food on their table. And usually it's actually to better something and to help the humanity. And it's not like in these movies where they're portrayed as some eccentric evil villains.
Evil villains. Yeah, totally, totally. I mean,
And and I don't like this prejudice, and I think that also is imposed in school context, that people who are interested in science or in some of these intellectual disciplines are usually marked as kind of awkward. That is something very wrong. I think scientists can be super communicative. They can express themselves in very flamboyant ways, and that should be encouraged.
absolutely. I mean, I'm so glad you brought that up. This goes back to the, you know, when we were discussing your paper on linguistic injustice, it seems to me a lot of the problem tends to be, it's not even per se, you know, like your background, your gender, race. It's more about these preconceived notions or caricatures of who we have in mind that the ideal scientist should be. And then anything that falls off that ideal is like, oh, this person's, you know, not really that. And again, this is probably why Žižek has this fame in popular culture, because of course he's an eccentric kind of guy, but also he comes off not as a typical philosopher, you know, you'd think, you know, call it up and talking in abstruse terms no one understands. I find that I certainly agree with that. Okay, this one I don't know if it's okay if I read this bit out, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts on this would be. I'll share my screen because it's a bit of a mouthful, Vlasta. Yeah, yeah. So this is not from one of Žižek's popular books, but I found this was quite a good excerpt on like more of like his metaphysical speculations of what science is. So I'll just read it out for the listener. This is from Žižek's book. Did somebody say totalitarianism? From 2002. And he goes, the most fundamental way reality appears to us, the most fundamental way we experience what really counts as actually existing, is always already presupposed in our judgments of what really is. The transcendental level was indicated by Kuhn himself when, in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he claimed that the shift in a scientific is less more than a mere shift in our external perspective on or perception of reality, but less than our actually creating another new reality. The standard distinction between the social or psychological contingent conditions of a scientific invention and its objective truth value falls short here. The least one can say about it is that the very distinction between the empirical, contingent, socio-psychological genesis of a certain scientific formation and its objective truth value, independent of the conditions of this genesis, already presupposes a set of distinctions between genesis and truth values, etc., which are by no means self-evident. So I really like that excerpt. And again, because you approach your philosophy more empirically, not, you know, the way he writes very speculatively. I'm just wondering, Vlasta, as a philosopher of science, what your thoughts on that little bit is by Žižek.
I must admit that I'm a little bit fearful that I might misinterpret it. So what I could say is that I think that we never exit out of our own positionality, or that it's really hard. So we might try to extend it, to extend our perspective, and that we are training ourselves to be more open and to expose ourselves to new things and to different methods. And the more methods we know, or the more methods are tested on one problem, the plurality of methods, or the triangulation, the more robust results we are getting. But especially and of course, there are different scientific disciplines which have more or less reliable results. And even in math, which we would think as paradigmatically something as most reliable, it does happen that the research, for also pragmatic reasons. So somebody submits certain proofs to a journal, but this person is not famous, doesn't come from a famous place. The editor finds it suspicious and doesn't bother further. And maybe this result was great, maybe it wasn't, but these social factors play a role, and they do also help us in a sense to be pragmatic, and they are in a sense our heuristics. That we reason quickly, that we make good decisions, and they're usually reliable, but not always, which is an additional problem. But in humanities, it matters a lot what is our positionality. And it relates us to this first question, which even in natural sciences, which topics are we going to explore? So if someone comes from the global south, then this person is maybe more motivated to explore the diseases that are pressing from in that community, but then there is no funding, and other problems occur. But it makes and in natural science, in social sciences and humanities, or I usually cluster them together. That is, again, coming from my positionality, because in my country, they would consider them together. But in some other contexts, they would differentiate them. And then you really see, okay, this is so influential. Your positionality is so influential to how you will think and which questions you will ask. And maybe the last comment, also from this paper on linguistic injustice, this was a speculative example that I made, and that's that the way how I learned articles in English. in Slavic languages, there are no articles. Yeah, I see you're surprised. The same, my American friend was very surprised by that, and he asked me, well, how then do you say a chair and the chair? And I was like, why would you want to say a chair? It's just chair. And he tried to explain to me the difference between a chair and the chair. And then I said, okay, a chair is then like a platonic idea.
The ideal chair, the platonic chair.
Exactly. And then he said yes. And then I thought, okay, great. Old Greek had articles, but Latin had no articles. So I really wonder how Plato would reason if he would be a speaker of a Latin language.
Yeah. Nah,
right? Because your language directs you in a way how you will think. And that's
Heidegger,
not easy to exit it.
Yeah, Heidegger said very famously that no, language is the house of your being. You know, like it conceptualizes your reality in some sense. And also, Vlasta, if you don't mind a passing comment, there's a joke that whenever philosophers want to make a point, it's always a chair or a hammer or a table. So I love that the example was a chair. This is always the case. The example would be like a common household thing. Excellent.
Well,
That's
that is also, I am part of the community
the philosophical community, exactly, right?
this
This adds on to our point, the Žižekian point, certainly. Now, thank you so much for entertaining me with that. I mean, I'm so glad being and I know you don't really like this the delineation between continental and analytical, but certainly, let's say an empirical philosopher like yourself, I'm so glad you're kind of open to Zizek's ideas, because I've spoken to many philosophers of science on the podcast, about 5 or 6, and only you and one other person has been open to kind of at least considering his ideas, because a lot of the others think that he is just speaking nonsense, or like he's more like a poet instead of an actual philosopher.
But even if they think that, they should still be able to be open enough to comment. I mean, we also comment on poets, don't we?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, no. I mean, also this is just a podcast. It's like there's no harm done in speculating a bit. But thank you very much, Vlasta, for entertaining me with that.
I
So
mean, no, I just wanted to say this also as a normative stance, right? So if we are preaching epistemic tolerance and openness and so forth, then we should also practice it.
that's true. Yeah. I mean, perhaps that's what differentiates science and philosophy from religious dogma. Where we are open to things that radically uproot our worldview, even in some sense. Alrighty, that would really be my last question. So I kind of want to ask, going back to kind of the work you're doing. Well, I guess just for our listeners, as a philosopher of science, what would you say right now are the most important areas of research, or the most important questions people, a person like me, a layperson, I'm hoping to go into research next year, but someone who's kind of starting off in their career, what do you think are the most interesting areas to explore?
In philosophy of science,
I
or
would say, yeah, in your field, philosophy of science, and if you want to comment on obviously outside of your field, sure, you sure can, but just given your domain expertise is in
Mhm.
philosophy of science.
We are definitely seeing this huge shift with AI and what AI will mean for science, and that is something that we all have to face and think about, and also think how are we reacting to this? How much are we integrating it? How are we adjusting to it? What does this mean also for the education? Because that comes together, in my opinion. But I also think it's completely fine to just do something that one is intrinsically interested in.
Mm,
And maybe also, yeah, then you bring some diverse perspective. So
yeah. Well, I'm curious, why did you kind of add that additional comment that it's important to even do what one is intrinsically interested in, over kind of like the pragmatic thinking where is currently society going, and kind of going along with that?
the both things are positive. Let's go back again to the COVID example. It was a real problem. It had to be addressed. A lot of effort was put there. It was a directed effort. It gave a lot of results. Something similar is probably happening now with the AI era or revolution or whatever we call it. And that also makes a lot of sense. But even in this context, other questions are still important. And if you think science in general, I really like some questions that biology and life sciences are still having to answer. And they are related, for instance, to regenerative medicine. So the question of slowing down aging, or changing some of these processes to the research regarded, of course, Alzheimer's disease, regarded cancer research. So there are a lot of super important, and now we also see this issue with the resistance on bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics, and that is a huge challenge that will be there. So there is a lot of there are a lot of topics that I see that are very important for our society, and then of course we all find something which we find specifically interesting and important for us, and then we're trying to address it. and the topic of how are we in philosophy. So the topic how are we relating to non-human animals is something super important. The topic of justice in general in philosophy is super important, of ethics of different types of technologies, including biotechnologies, or the merger of biotechnology with the AI technologies and everything that's going to happen there or not going to happen there. So all these questions are really big and important questions. And then it's very, so let's say to nurture the diversity of thoughts and of hypotheses, I would really give academic freedom to people to explore more than just one topic, which is okay at the moment hot topic. So that can help you to be in public. That will also help you to contribute to society, but you can also contribute in different ways.
Yeah, beautiful. I think that's a great place to end the conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Vlasta. I really am grateful for it.
Thank
And
you. Thank you.
I'm so sorry that I made you stay up past midnight. I had no idea.
No, it's completely fine. And it was a great pleasure. And I really loved reading your questions. And you did challenge me intellectually, which was amazing. And I love your energy. And yeah, it's a great experience for me.
That's great to hear. It was a pleasure. That's really kind of you.